Well, hey there, third through sixth graders. It's time to continue with the Tiger Rising. Yesterday we read chapters 19 and 20, and there was quite a few things that went on in those two little chapters. Chapter 19, Beauchamp and Rob are at the tiger's cage, and Rob is getting instructions on how to feed the tiger. Beauchamp gave him a set of keys, and as we moved into chapter 20, another day, Sistine's coming home from school on the bus. Later in that day that Rob had been out to feed the tiger. And she was all excited, of course. She wanted to go running right out right away. Matter of fact, she changed back into the clothes that Rob had given her in an earlier chapter to go back out to the cage and visit the tiger. And as you move through this chapter, you see some of the emotions, some of the buried emotions and feelings that Rob has surface. And of course, Sistine gets very emotional once she discovers that Rob has the keys and that they could unlock the cage and let the tiger escape, something that she really wants to see happen. There's a lot of kind of interesting parallels that go on metaphorically throughout the story. When we look at these characters and how their personalities build, you see Rob, who is very much inside himself, keeps his feelings and expectations kind of locked up in a suitcase. And here on the other hand, you've got Sistine, who's very strong-willed and outspoken and doesn't really hold anything in at all, speaks her mind. And we look at the symbolism of the tiger and the cage and what that might mean in within the context of the storyline itself between these characters. Looking at someone who's caged up, can't escape, much like Rob's feelings being caged up and not being able to escape. And then the personality of the tiger being very strong and straightforward in comparison to Sistine as a character in the story. Anyhow, these are the kind of things that you should be kind of picking up on and thinking about as we move through the story. Because when an author writes a story like this, a lot of times it's not what's clearly evident in the words that is really the point of the story. Sometimes it's more about what's just underneath the surface. Anyhow, chapter 21, let's take a look today in 21 and 22 and see what happens next in The Tiger Rising. By the time they started walking back to the Kentucky Star, it was dusk. Sistine was not crying, but she wasn't talking either, not even about letting the tiger go. "I have to call my mother," she said to him in a tired voice when they got to the motel. "I'll go with you," said Rob. She didn't tell him not to, so he walked with her across the parking lot. They were almost to the laundry room when Willie Mae materialized out of the purple darkness, but she was leaning up against her car, smoking a cigarette. "Boo," she said to Rob. "Hey, he told her back. Somebody following you, she said, jerking her head at Sistine. This is Sistine, Rob told her. And then he turned to Sistine and said, this is Willie Mae, the one I was telling you about, the one who had the bird and let it go. So what? Said Sistine. So nothing, said Willie Mae. Her glasses winked in the light from the falling Kentucky star. So I had me a bird. Why are you hanging around in the parking lot trying to scare people? Sistine asked, her voice hard and mean. I ain't trying to scare people, said Willie Mae. Willie Mae works here, said Rob. That's right, said Willie Mae. She reached into the front pocket of her dress and pulled out a package of 8-ball gum. You know what? She said to Sistine. I know you. You ain't got to introduce yourself to me. You angry. You got all the anger in the world inside of you. I know angry when I meet it. Been angry most of my life. I'm not angry, Sistine snapped. All right, said Willie Mae. She opened a package of 8-ball. You an angry liar, then. Here you go. She held out a stick of gum to Sistine. Sistine stared for a long minute at Willie Mae, and Willie Mae stared back. The last light of dusk disappeared and the darkness moved in. Rob held his breath. He wanted desperately for the two of them to like each other. When Sistine finally reached out and took the gum from Willie Mae, he let his breath go in a quiet whoosh. Willie Mae nodded at Sistine, and then she extended the pack to Rob. He took a piece and put it in his pocket for later. Willie Mae lit another cigarette and laughed. Ain't that just like God, she said, throwing the two of you together. She shook her head. This boy, full of sorrow, keeping it down low in his legs, and you, she pointed her cigarette at Sistine, all full of anger, got it snapped up out of you like lightning. You some pair, that's the truth. She put her arms over her head and stretched and then straightened up and stepped away from the car. Sistine stared at Willie Mae with her mouth open. How tall are you? She asked. 6'2", said Willie Mae, and I got to get and go home. But first, I got some advice for you. I already gave this boy some advice. You ready for yours? Sistine nodded. Her mouth fell open. This is it. Ain't nobody gonna come and rescue you, said Willie Mae. She opened the car door and sat down behind the wheel. You gotta rescue yourself. You understand what I mean? Sistine stared at Willie Mae, and she said nothing. Willie Mae cranked the engine. Rob and Sistine watched her drive away. I think she's a prophetess, said Sistine. A what? Rob said. A prophetess. They're all painted all over the Sistine ceiling. They're women who God speaks through. Oh, said Rob, a prophetess. He turned a word over in his mouth. Prophetess. He said again. He nodded. That sounded right. If God was going to talk through anybody, it made sense to Rob that he would pick Willie Mae. Chapter 22. You out in the woods with that girl again? His father asked as soon as Rob stepped into the room. Yes, sir, said Rob. Look over here, son. His father was standing by Rob's bed. Sir, said Rob. His heart sank. He knew what his father had found. The meat. He had hidden it under his bed until it was time to go and feed the tiger again. Where'd this meat come from? His father asked, pointing at the bloody brown bag. Without thinking, Rob said, Beauchamp. Beauchamp, his father repeated, low and dark. Beauchamp? He didn't hardly pay me enough to get by, and now he's giving us this rotten meat. He thinks I ain't man enough to put meat on my own table? Rob wanted to say something, but then he thought of Beauchamp and held his tongue. I ought to teach him a lesson, his father said. The cords in his neck stood out like twigs. He kicked the bag of meat. I ought to, he said, making me work for less than nothing and giving us rotten meat. He went and stood in front of the gun case. He didn't unlock it. He just stood and stared and cracked his knuckles. Daddy, said Rob, but he couldn't think of anything to say after that. His mother had known how to calm his father. She would put her hand on his arm and say his name in a soft and reproachful voice, and that would be enough. But Rob didn't know how to do those things. He stood for a minute more, and then he walked over to his bed and grabbed a piece of wood and his knife. As he left the room, his father was still standing at the locked gun case, staring through the glass at the deer hunting rifle as if he was trying to will the gun into his hands. Rob walked to the Kentucky Star sign. He sat down underneath it and leaned up against one of the cold, damp poles and started to work on the wood. But his hand was too full of his father's anger and Sistine's tears. He couldn't concentrate. He looked up at the dark underside of the sign and recalled lying on a blanket, staring up at a big oak tree. His mother had been on one side of him and his father asleep and snoring. He had been on the other side. He remembered that his mother had taken hold of his hand and pointed up at the sun shining through the leaves of the tree and said, "Look, Rob, I have never in my life seen a prettier color of green. Ain't it perfect?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, staring at the leaves. "It looks like the original green, the first one ever thought up." His mother squeezed his hand hard. "That's right," she said, "the first one ever thought up. The first ever green. You and me, we see the world the same." He concentrated on the green, and he let it seep through a crack in his suitcase of not thoughts and filled up his head with color. He wondered if Willie Mae's cricket had been the same bright and original green. That's what he thought about as he carved, and so he wasn't surprised when he stopped and held the wood away from himself to see a wing and a beak and a tiny eye. It was cricket, Willie Mae's cricket, coming to life under his knife. He worked on the bird for a long time until it looked so real that he half expected it to break into song. When he finally went back to the room, he found his father asleep in the recliner. The gun case was still locked and the bag of meat was gone. He wouldn't be able to feed the tiger in the morning. He'd have to wait until Beauchamp brought him another package. Rob went and stood over his father and stared down at him. He looked at his heavy hands and the bald spot on his nodding head. He was mesmerizing him and trying at the same time to understand him, to make some sense out of him, out of his anger and his quiet, comparing it to the way he used to sing and smile when his father jerked awake. "Hey," he said. "Hey," Rob said back. "What time is it?" "I ain't sure," said Rob. "Late, I guess." His father sighed. "Go on, get me that leg medicine." Rob brought him the tube of medicine. Outside the motel room, the world creaked and sighed. The rain started in again, and his father's hands were gentle as he applied the ointment to Rob's legs. Well, that ends chapter 22. We'll pick it up again tomorrow. Chapters 23 and 24. We're getting probably 2/3 of the way through the book now. It won't be too long until we'll be arriving at the end of this story. Should be next week. Meanwhile, continue on with your taking notes and keeping your summary. Maybe tomorrow, being as it's Friday, we'll do a real quick review of what all has transpired so far up to date in this story. All right, that's it. You kids take care of yourselves and stay safe. make sure you're kind to someone today. All right? We'll see you tomorrow.